Have you ever wondered when you saw some of those movie stars on TV, how much time it took them to get ready before the cameras got turned on them? Well, I've thought a little about that because guess what? I don't have anybody fixing me up. You can tell that, I'm sure. So anyway, I am who I am. And I have wrinkles and baggy eyes and old people things, I'm sure. But anyway, I hope that you'll get some benefit out of what I'm doing here. Tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about my dad because I think there's some things to be learned from him, and that you just need to know him a little more, a little better. Some of you, I'm sure, have never laid eyes on him or known him at all, and others of you maybe have. But when we were working on the farm, why there was a milk herd of sorts, not a huge one, but enough to tie you down 365 days a year, morning and night. And there's not too many people that would buy into something that would tie them that close to home. But it was a way that he saw to try to get ahead. And I think I've mentioned he bought 112 acres, paid $5,000 for it, I think, and somehow found a way between he and my mother to do extra jobs and got it paid off, I think, in 5 years eventually. And people in the area said it couldn't be done because it wasn't a profitable place to have bought in the first place. But my dad did that, I think, because it was his hope. He didn't have, an education to speak of other than what he received through the first 8 grades. Neither did my mother. And yet they tried to butt their heads together and figure out a way that they could do what they wanted to do and make it work. And to their credit, I think they did a pretty good job. Not that I'm their shining example by any means, but still they did a great job. So with my dad being tied down to the cattle herd all that much, especially at milking time, we never did much picnicking in the hills or camping out or anything like that. And even when I got into high school and was selected for some of the athletic teams, football and basketball in particular, mostly basketball I'm referencing here, but because especially during the earlier years, I was playing on some of the younger teams, and those games would be the same time that the cows needed to be milked. And I don't know what you know about milk cows, but if you get them off schedule or you decide you don't want to milk them, you don't ever want to do that because it'll ruin the whole herd. But if you get them off schedule, it doesn't help. Their productivity goes down. So I understood when he said that he couldn't get to the games because he had the cows to milk, and that the only way I could get to the games is if I left my job and let him do my job and his job both, and he was willing to do that. So there's times when usually it would be from the other boys' parents. They'd say, well, where's your dad tonight? Like he should have been there, or, you played a good game and your dad didn't even get to see you, or this, that. And I didn't say much other than that I just told him that he was home taking care of the cattle that had to be milked. And I never felt like I needed to apologize for that. He did get away a few times when I was in my senior year and watched me play. And I'm not sure, sometimes you could start the cattle milking just a little early if things worked out right and you didn't have too many to milk. at a particular time of the year, but he watched a few of them. And other than that, our association with each other, well, even with that, our association with each other was mostly work. He taught me how to do a lot of things, and he did a lot of things with me. In teaching me how, he had to show me how, and not just tell me to go do it, but show me how to do it right, whether it was clean ditches or put in fences or even, later on cutting the hay and plowing fields, all kinds of things. And so it was a good life because I've got to be around him every single day. He wasn't off traveling on a truck across country or whatever. He was there, but when he was there, he was seemed like either working or eating or sleeping, or later in his life a little TV. But I always admired him because of what he was able to accomplish, and the fact that he wasn't afraid to work. I think I mentioned when he got our house from an old rundown abandoned house up one of the canyons in our little area there, and drug it down to the house, and then dug the basement out from under it after he'd put a cement wall to drag it up onto. I had to dig the basement out by hand underneath it. Well, didn't have backhoes and all that kind of stuff. We had a little scoop behind a horse-drawn chain that we'd put on, shovel it full, and drag it out. And that's how he did things, and it was hard work. He dug a well by our house, just go out with a shovel and start digging. And dig down and dig down and dig down and dig down and keep throwing the dirt out until you finally hit water. And then you'd keep digging because you wanted the water to be clean and be able to settle out and not make you sick or it be dirty. And hooked a pump up to it, put it into our basement and into our pipes in the house eventually. But we eventually did have somebody come and drill a well with an old-fashioned machine. It's hard to describe the machine, but that wasn't until later on in my early high school years that we did that. And as far as fun goes, he tried. I'll say that much for him. I remember one time, and the thing about it is you could always tell if he'd made a sacrifice, because you knew if he was away from the house at cow milking time that he had made arrangements for somebody to help out, and it wasn't easy. And I can't even remember the details of who he got to help one time, but there was this one time that it was during the deer hunting season, and he had a friend that he would go deer hunting with, and we had to drive up in the hills maybe 5 or 6 miles, and that's where we ended up camping out in a tent. And my dad just didn't do that kind of thing, but he did this one time, and I know he did it for me. And I think if I had to, I don't know this for a fact, but if I had to guess, it would be part of it he kind of wanted to do, maybe to bring back memories of the old days. But I think a lot of it maybe was because my mom was prodding him a little bit to go do something with his son, go do something with me. And like other men did with their sons. And so he had this friend, he took his son, and Dad took me. We went out and camped overnight in this tent, deer hunting. It was up on the south side of Midnight Mountain. We called it. We slept the night, and he told me, that we were going to be getting up early because we had to get out and get up where we needed to be before the deer stopped moving around and where we could see them and maybe get a shot at one. Because he wanted to be successful. what father doesn't want to show off a little bit, for their sons when they're hunting. It's kind of how we prove our manhood. So he got me up early, and I can remember it was quite cold. There was even a little frost on the ground. Up where we were, because it's a little higher in the mountains, and we went up, and early in the morning, I followed along behind him up a trail. He'd hunted this area before, knew it from days gone by, but it was an area called the Parks, and I don't know why they call it the Parks, but it was on the south side of Midnight Mountain, and he had me trail along till we got to a certain point, and by then the day was starting to dawn a little bit. There's starting to get some light, and it was probably almost light enough to shoot a deer if you saw one. So he showed me how to walk so that I wasn't making much noise. And he'd stop every now and then. I noticed he'd walk a few steps and then pause and kind of motion for me to pause too. And he'd listen. And then he'd walk a few more steps and pause and listen. And I came to find out later that part of the reason he did that was because if somebody did hear us and we just weren't trudging along the whole time, but we'd stop and pause, they might think we were just another deer, at least if they couldn't smell us or anything and couldn't see us. So that was part of the strategy. And he told me some kind of tricks of the trade, I guess. He says, if you hear a squirrel or something, a tree squirrel, start chattering, why, that might be a sign there's a deer walking past that squirrel, and there might be one coming along, and you better get ready, and maybe you can hit it. So he taught me as we went along. Well, we got to a certain point. We hadn't seen any deer, and he was, I think, determined that I should get a shot at a deer. And he set me in kind of a little basin that was kind of up on a ridge, at least off of one slope on a ridge. And he told me that he was going to go down around and come back up through a group of pines and quakies that were there. So he told me where to sit, and he told me where to look, and he'd go around the hill on the other side and come back up through this area and see if he couldn't drive a deer up past me where I could get a shot. Well, the plan went pretty well because I sat there and it looked like a good spot. I look and listen for tree squirrels or snaps of twigs or anything that I thought might indicate there was a deer coming along that maybe he'd spooked up. And I listened and listened. I never saw anything and heard very little. And I waited and waited and waited, and nothing came along. I got a little bored with that project. So I sat down on a rock and thought, well, I'll just watch here from the rock, and if something comes along, I'll raise up my rifle. It was the 30-30 rifle, lever action, and I'll shoot that deer as soon as I see it. So I just sat there, and there was no action. And I kind of gazing around, looking at the sunrise and trees and different things, and just kind of taking nature in. Well, all of a sudden I heard this thump, 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 and I looked up, and there was a deer, a big deer. It was a huge buck, at least it was a 4-point buck, and it was big, but that thump, thump, thump was all I was able to. By the time I saw the deer and got my rifle in my hands, it was gone. And I can remember when my dad came through. Finally, he said, "Did you see anything? Did you see anything?" Because he must have heard it running out or something from where he was at. And I said, I did. It was a huge deer. And you could just see the disappointment on his face. I'm like, oh no, you mean I went to all that work and then I actually did my job and I got a deer to come out right in front of you and you weren't ready? And I had to admit that it got away from me before I could do anything. So it turned out that was kind of the size of our hunt as far as getting anything, but I've never forgotten it. And part of the reason I've never forgotten it is because as I've grown older and I recognize what kind of sacrifice my dad made, not only to leave somebody else with the chores that night and the next morning, but also to just drive that deer around, make sure that everything was right for me. Probably could have gone down there and shot that deer himself and been fine, but he was trying to give me the setup, and I thought, that's kind of the way he was in life. With his livelihood, he was trying to get us every advantage that we could, so that when the time came, we'd be ready. and the time, eventually came, and I can't say that I was ready, but for life, I mean, but it wasn't because he didn't try. Just like that only overnight deer hunt I ever remember having with him. We did go on other hunts, but that was the only overnighter. So another time I can remember him having some fun, or wanting me to have some fun and providing it for me, was it was in the late fall, maybe not too late. It was, September-ish. And we got in an old truck. And again, I think it was because my mother was prodding him a little bit, like, take him out and do some hunting. And it wasn't deer hunting season then, but it was grouse season. And we went hunting blue grouse and willow grouse up in the hills, in a similar area to where we hunted deer, but not quite as far, not quite as deep in. And we parked along the side of the road and had our shotguns. He had a 12 gauge and I had a 410. And we walked up through the trees, and it was a beautiful one of those autumn days when the leaves were beautiful and the sun was just warm. It was just a really pleasant experience to be out in the trees, and especially hunting with my dad. That I didn't get to do that with very often at all. And in fact, I think that's the only time I can remember that we went grouse hunting. We did deer hunt several times together, but grouse hunting, I think that's the only time that I can remember. I can remember going with my friends, but not with my dad. That was the only time. But even then, there was an experience that I had that I've never forgotten. Isn't it interesting how sometimes you can just have one experience and it'll last you for a lifetime in your mind, in your memory? I think sometimes we saturate ourselves with things, and then because we've got so many, it's kind of like having a new toy. If you have one new toy, you remember it, but if you have 50 of them or 20 or whatever, you can't remember any of them. So anyway, it was so special that this grouse hunting experience, that for some reason I remembered it. And let me tell you why. We'd hiked up it's kind of a gradual rise to the hillside, and we hiked up in there a little ways. And again, we were kind of quiet, sometimes when you're scared to grouse out, it would just fly, and we'd have to be careful. so that we were close enough in that if one did fly, we could actually see where it went and shoot it on the fly or whatever. But we never saw any grouse, no willow grouse, no blue grouse. So you're saying, well, then what was so memorable about that? At least when you went deer hunting, you got to see a deer for like 3 jumps before it disappeared. But not even a single willow grouse or a ruffled grouse or blue grouse did we see that day. But there was a place where I was I can still visualize it in my mind. There's a place where he asked me to kind of stay. It was just kind of on a little outcropping of rock next to some quaking aspen. He said, you just sit here for a while. I'm going to go up through here. And he went up through, I guess, to see if there was any better hunting or more grouse up in that area. And I just did what he asked me to do and stayed there. But after I'd stayed there a while, I didn't really get concerned about him not coming back or anything, but it was quite a while. And I started to walk just a little ways away from where I was to see if I could spot him up on the hill or hear him up in the trees or something. And I couldn't. But I went just far enough away that I looked down the hill, and there was this, I don't know what the diameter would have been on this quaking aspen tree. Maybe 14 inches or something like that. It was a big diameter tree. And I saw my grandfather's name, where he'd carved his name in that tree. And it said Arthur, and then down below it had the initial E for Eborn. And I looked at it, and at first I had to do a double take to make sure that that's really what it was. And the letters, the tree had grown so much since he carved those initials, because he was he was gone by then. I don't think he'd passed away by then, but he was close to it. He was quite old. And I can remember looking at those initials, and I'd already heard about my grandfather, how he used to herd sheep for some of the local ranchers up in that area when he was just a boy. He was an orphaned boy. And he got passed around to different families. His parents had died earlier, and his mother had died earlier, and his dad, that's a whole other story. But his dad didn't play a part in his life. And so he got kind of orphaned and passed around. And to help him earn his keep, he would herd sheep for different people up there. And I know that that's what he was doing when he carved those initials. And when I saw it, it just took me back. I went back through 2 generations, tried to picture him up there as a little orphaned boy, trying to herd sheep in that same area, and getting bored and carving his initials in a tree. Who would have known that 2 generations later I would come by when that tree was old and gnarly, and the letters had kind of meshed together by then. But I could still see his initials there in that tree. I often wish that I could have gone back and spotted them again, but I never did get back. And I'm sure not too long after that, the tree would have fallen over. It was just an aging tree. But it gave me a connection to the hill, to the mountains, to my ancestry. And there's something special about just seeing his name there and thinking about all of that. Well, anyway, that's another story about my dad. We didn't get a deer, and we didn't get a grouse. But let me tell you another story. I think I've told you he was the water master on a 14-mile stretch of canal that he had. He was responsible for making sure all the farmers along that canal got their turns of water into their various ditches, and the head gates were set right so that they got the right amount, and there was enough left for somebody else to have some, and he could turn different streams of water to different people for certain periods of time and make sure that they got their crops watered. And it was quite a task and a responsibility. And occasionally, he told about some stories where some of the farmers would, after he got their set gates head and give them the amount of water that they were supposed to get, that some of the farmers would come up and raise the head gate so they'd get a little more. Well, all that did is make, so the next guy down the stream didn't get as much. And it kind of upset my dad that think that they would do that. And he had a run-in with 2 or 3 of them. Nothing serious, I don't think. But he made it clear to them that he wouldn't tolerate it and that it wasn't right. But that's not the story. The story was in the fall of the year after the water, which came out of a place called Miles Creek, clear up in East Liberty, or not East Liberty, West Liberty. And I've been up there with my dad. We put some boards in it in the creek and forced the water into the canal when it was irrigation season. So the water would be diverted out of at least some of the water would be diverted out of the creek and into this canal. And they left a little in there to go into another canal. But that was my dad's job too, was to put that water divert that water from the creek into the canal so the farmers could have it all summer for irrigating. And so it was in the fall of the year after they were all done irrigating and the crops had been taken care of and gathered in, and the farmers had used what little they had to water ponds and things for their stock to water in, or their stock to go to water. And then he would take the water out of the canal. He'd go clear back up to where he let it in originally, put the boards back in take the boards that he had put in the creek out of the creek so that the water could go back into its natural stream bed, and the irrigation season was essentially done. And it was his job, after that was done, to walk the canal. So it's about a 14-mile canal, but he didn't walk at all, I don't think, in one day ever that I'm aware of. But there's a place where you have to, or it goes up some hollows and kind of diverts back and so forth. And sometimes the canal's in bad shape, or the cattle or whatever had been in, messed up the ditch bank. And anyway, he got in the habit of always walking that canal after the water was out. And I guess it would have been maybe 3 miles, 4 miles along the canal, probably more like 3 anyway, along the canal, that there was a place where the canal actually went under a road that went up into the hills, the same road that we'd gone grouse and deer hunting on. There was a place where that canal water went under that road. It was a gravel road. And we'd arranged for, my mother knew about what time he would be coming by there. She had dropped him off earlier in the morning and knew about what time he would be coming by there. And so she and I think one of my other siblings, I can't remember who was there if I remember right, but we went up where this water was going to cross the canal, where we could meet up with him and take him some lunch and have a little picnic lunch on the end gate, I guess. That's how we did it. Kind of mixed our lunch with our work. And he came by. Eventually, we could see him. I could see him. I wasn't all that old at the time. I don't know how old I would have been, maybe only 7 or 8 years old, but I can remember seeing him coming along the canal, and I told my mother, I says, I think I can see him up there, and she says, well, it should be about time. Why don't you run up along the canal and meet him? I bet he'd be tickled to see you. And so I did. And I even had some boots that I put on and got down to the canal. Now keep in mind, the canal wasn't full of water now because my father had let it out. And it was, it had water in it because the water had just recently been let out, but it wasn't running water. It was like in little pools and things. And I got in it, and we went up along at first I went up along the ditch bank, and then canal bank, and then I finally crawled down into the canal about where I thought he would be. And I can remember seeing him and just being excited to see him. I hollered out to him, and I went up to him, and he, and just as I came up there, he had some coveralls. I don't know if you know what they are. They're clothes that you put over your clothes so you don't get them all dirty and wet and muddy. But he had a pair of coveralls on, and just as I got there, I saw him reach with his shovel and into one of these little pools that was left from turning the water out of the canal. And out came a fish and onto the rocks. And he grabbed it and put it in his coveralls. Okay, so just picture this. He'd walked quite a ways, and he already had coveralls. I won't say they were full of fish, but there was a lot. There were fish in the legs of his coveralls, and what he had done is he'd taken a piece of wire and wrapped it around his coveralls onto his leg, and then, of course, the part that buttoned up along his where your shirt would normally button up or zip up was loose, and when he catch fish, he'd just throw it in his coveralls, and he'd go down into his leg area until he hit that wire. And that's where they stayed flipping and flopping around. Well, I kind of got quite a chuckle out of it because there he was. And his pants a little down lower, his coverall leggings looked like they were going to run away with him because he had fish in there flopping around. And I can remember he was just kind of laughing because I was laughing at him. It was just funny. And he invited me down, and I went down, and then we kept going down the canal towards where my mother was waiting. And there was a couple of real nice pools where there were quite a few trout, and these were trout that had come down Miles Creek and into the canal area, which is where the water was diverted. And now the water was down. They were just going to be there and die because there wouldn't be any water for them. But while there was still a little pool here and there, my dad was filling his pants up with trout. And it was so funny. I can't even describe what it looked like, but you'll just have to close your eyes. In your mind's eye, see him walking along with a trout flipping around in his trousers. And I don't know why he didn't bonk him on the head or something, but he didn't. He just stuck him in there. And we got to a place where there were several trout, and the water was a little deeper. And he asked me to get a stick, and he'd get his shovel, and we'd try to scare them off to one end, and eventually they'd get up where it was not very deep, and we'd flip them out on the rocks and stick them down his sleeve or his coveralls into his pant leggings, and watch him flip. And before we got to the truck, I'm telling you, he had pretty much both leggings filled up with fish. Now, I don't know what arrangement he had worked out with the game warden, but he never said anything about that. We were way over our limit, I know that. And I don't know whether he said something to the game warden about, you mind if I catch those fish? Because they're just going to die anyway if somebody doesn't. Whether he had something worked out, I don't know. I was just too excited to see the fish. And when we got to where my mother was, she got his lunch, started walking towards us, and before she got there, she was just laughing too when she could see what was happening, because when we were still down the ditch, we flipped a couple of them in there, and she saw what was going on, and she started laughing too, and we all of us just sat there on the bank of the canal and just laughed. And my dad finally got up on the bank and reached down, undid the wire on his sleeve or on his coveralls, leggings, undid the wire, and the fish just flopped out on the grass. They were still flopping. I don't think we ever got a count because there was a lot of them, and they weren't big fish. Don't get me wrong; they weren't 2-pounders or anything like that. They were, 6 inches, 8 inches. Maybe the biggest one would have been 10 inches, and that was rare. But there was a lot of fish, and we got really quite a chuckle out of it. And so we mixed fun and work, and he did his best to make that happen when there's a chance to have a little fun at work. And in that case, we filled our freezer, not filled our freezer, but had a pretty good bunch of fish after we'd cleaned them to put into the freezer. And we had some good fish fries that night for a few days after, because there was lots of trout that had come out of his pants. Well, anyway, interesting how those things burn themselves into your memories. Things that warm our hearts and get us laughing do that. We remember those things longer. The other things we remember longer are tragedies and scary moments and things like that. Seems to be that we remember things that are on both ends of that emotional spectrum, whether it's a negative side or whether it's positive and laughter. We tend to retain it in our memories longer. The ho-hum days, we don't retain so much. So I guess the message here is, there's a couple of messages. One is, even though my dad couldn't do much with me, he's a pretty darn good dad, and he tried. And the other thing is, all work and no play, this, as the saying goes, makes Jack a dull boy. In this case, it makes Reed a dull boy. And I think my mother knew it, and my dad knew it, and they did the best they could. And I'm grateful for them for that. And it's something that I should have taken to heart more and did more of with my own children, even though I made an effort to as best I could, I thought at the time. Now that I look back on it, I think, well, I could have done a lot better. But hopefully there was some good come out of it all. And the memories go back through the generations, even back to that carved name on the aspen tree, generations and generations ago. We're all tied together. We just need to keep working, plugging away. If there's sadnesses or disappointments, we need to try to patch them up and heal them and enjoy each other. Let's do that. Good night.